can be an enlightened asshole, and you haven't integrated your brokenness into the enlightenment.
Pleasure to meet you. And
Sure.
this is what I do. What I do is I get to chat with awesome people like you, and it's a pleasure. I thought, just as an interesting way of introduction, I'm curious when it comes to sort of labels or how you define yourself, if at all. So, for example, do you consider yourself to be a Christian? Are you a mystic? Are you a Christian mystic? Does any of that stick to you or apply to you in any meaningful way?
Yeah, I put it this way. I would say that I most directly identify with the Catholic tradition of the Christian faith, and in particular with the mystical lineage of contemplative mystical Christianity, the Christian mystics, and in a spirit of openness to the mystical lineage of all the world's great religions. So when I was in the monastery, I was 6 years in the monastery with Thomas Merton, this cloistered Trappist monastery. And while I was there, Thich Nhat Hanh came from Vietnam to talk with Merton. And through Merton, I was introduced to the Dharma. And Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Jewish mystic and philosopher, came. And I got very involved in medieval philosophy and the reading of Judaism and the reading of Martin Buber, I and Thou. Merton was very in-depth dialogue with mystical Islam, with the Sufi tradition, Rumi and Hafiz and so on, and the Hindu tradition, the Bhagavad Gita, I am that, Namaste, so on. So I deeply identify with, and I've been enriched by these traditions, but I most identify with the Christian mystics that have transformed me: St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart, Claude of Unknowing, Julian of Norwich, and how that translates into daily life, and also in my work as a clinical psychologist, where spirituality is a resource in healing and transformative, the depth dimension of the healing encounter. So I would describe myself in those terms.
Fascinating. We're gonna sort of pick apart some of those people you mentioned and some of that journey as well. I wanted to tell a bit of a personal story about why we're talking today. I sort of stumbled upon your work listening to your podcast, Turning to the Mystics. And in one of the podcasts, you lead listeners at the end in this meditation, and you ask them to repeat this phrase, "Be still and know that I am God," and slowly take away the words until you just get down to the word be. And I was sitting in my apartment by myself, and I closed my eyes and I did what you told me to do, Jim. And I have to say that what happened to me, I can only describe as a mystical, transcendent experience. And I just remember thinking, whatever you wanted, whatever you could have hoped the best case scenario for that moment would be, it happened to me. And I just want you to tell me what happened to me.
Here's one way that I would put it. Okay. That our faith tells us that God is here now, all about us and within us. St. Augustine is closer to us than we are to ourselves. And in faith, we interiorly assent to that. Like in our heart, we believe there's a deep truth in that. What happens in moments like this is you intimately experience what faith proclaims. So that somehow, how I put it mystically, it's like unexplainably resting in God, resting in you, where somehow you and God mutually disappear as dualistically other than each other. And in that moment, you become a momentary mystic, that you experience the wonder of this all-encompassing oneness that transcends and permeates our life, our standing up and sitting down. Only you taste it directly for yourself. And I think that's what it is. It's a quickening, like an inner quickening in your heart.
Explain a little bit about, the science is probably the wrong word, but that particular phrase, the way that you asked to say it, the use of the bell. Why do you think that sort of recipe can lead people into that? Because you wanted it to do that, and it did that.
Yes. Well, my sense of it is this. You know that phrase, be still and know that I am God, comes from the Psalms. See, ponder on your bed and be still. See, be still and know that I am God. So Thomas Merton is in the monastery, and at the time we slept in a common dormitory. They changed this the Second Vatican Council, but then it was on a straw mattress on boards, and there were just partitions between your little cells. And he's lying there in his cell, and he had insomnia. And he's lying there, and then he said, and suddenly the bed becomes an altar. And in a distant city somewhere, someone is suddenly able to pray, he says. And so I think the whole ethos of monastic life, the chanting of the Psalms, the silence, the simplicity, the seeking of God, kind of opens up the heart to that. There's another piece of it also. I think that the bell, I have my bell right here. It was a Buddhist meditation bell. Is the power of ritual. So there's something about like a liturgy of the body, like let's bow, like in reverential gratitude. Thomas Merton once said, with God, a little sincerity goes a long, long way. So when we bow in communal gratitude, like the least and the most we can do is surrender ourselves over to the gift and the miracle of being alive right now together, like this. And the ringing of the bell is a sound that tapers off into silence. So we're kind of tapping into kind of ancient, kind of archetypal, primordial patterns that invite this awakening.
When you transcend, how would you describe it to those who have no clue what we're talking about, or long for something like that but don't even know what it is?
Well, I want to say first some examples of how we do experience it. But because it's so subtle, we don't tend to notice the implications of what we're experiencing, which would be mystical experience in the broad sense. So I want to start first because we 10 times think of mystical experiences as these intense things the mystics speak of. And people say, I'd never experienced that. But like you said, the way you experience it when you be still and know that I am God, your heart can be quickened unexpectedly with a taste of it. So I'd like to start first with mystical experiences in daily life and then share my experience where it was intensified in the monastery. I want to give an example. Some examples. Let's say that you've been fortunate to be in a deep marital love relationship that has been for you so transformative and so profound and so life-changing, just immense gratitude. And you get a phone call from someone you knew in high school, say. They haven't heard from the person in years. They say they're passing through town and just to catch up with each other. And you're glad because you were friends in high school. It'll be interesting. And you're talking, you're sharing with each other about your work and what's happened and so on. And you tell this person about this relationship and this person, about how you met, about the person's character. You show the person the pictures, what the person looks like. And the person says, yes, I know, but what I'd like to know is this. Who is it that you know the person to be, not factually, but in your love for this person? And all of a sudden you realize that nothing you could say would do justice to who you know the person to be in love. And your heart breaks when you try. And you're graced to be strangely made whole by having your heart broken by this love that can't be expressed adequately in words. That's mysticism. It's like the unexpected nearness of the upwelling of a gift that cannot be explained. It washes over you and it touches you. Thomas Merton, at the end of New Season Contemplation, gives a litany of examples of this. He says, in the midst of nature, example he uses, he says, imagine you're out walking along somewhere in the midst of nature and you turn to see a flock of birds descending. And he says, as if out of the corner of your eye, you catch in their descent something primordial, vast, and true. And you're interiorly quickened in a kind of a subtle enrichment of awareness, a sensing that in some way you can't explain, God's the infinity of the intimate immediacy of the birds in their descent. And the birds in their descent is the concrete immediacy of God, and the concrete immediacy of God is in you being awakened to that, like that. And you're moved to just sit down and sit there for a while. Like, what in the hell was that? I can't say it. But having tasted it, I will not break faith with my awakened heart. I will not play the cynic. In an unexpected hour, I was quickened with this oneness. He says sometimes it can happen also in the presence of a child, reading a child a good night story. And you're just literally unraveled by the presence of this child. We're sitting in the presence of a dying loved one, like the mystery of it all. We're lying awake at night listening to the rain pour down all about the house, and the sense comes over you like this. So I think we all have moments like this, but we don't live in a society that teaches us to become students of these moments. And because what starts to happen for some people is these touches that happen every so often, touch, 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 is there's the desire to abide in the depths so fleetingly glimpsed. That is, having tasted the oneness, and it has about it the feeling of that which never ends. What would be a path or a way of life? Where could I find someone well seasoned in such things that could guide me? And this is the guidance of the mystic, turning to the mystics for guidance. They offer practical, first of all, how to discern that it's happening to you. Because sometimes it's so subtle, you don't calibrate your heart to a fine enough scale to pick it up. And then how can you cooperate with it? See, how can you go along with it to be like being transformed by God into God unexplainably forever in the ordinariness of your life? That's the feeling that it has for me.
From my experience, it almost aligns a little bit with this concept of being born again. I mean, I can speak on behalf of my own experience coming out of those moments and just feeling, just looking through the world with different eyes. Is that ring true to you at all?
Yes. There's a translation of Eckhart's teaching called Wandering Joy. And a person who wrote the foreword, I can't think of his name right now, he was the senior editor of Parabola, the journal Parabola, which is a great thing of mystical traditions. And he says at the beginning, he says, by the time of Jesus, it was already ancient. We must be born again. See? And so in this moment, so when it's actually happening, it's too deep to comprehend. It's too self-evident to doubt. And we're born again. Jesus said, you must be born again. And because we've become exiled from it. Here's another way that I put it, too, is that in the momentum of the day's demands, just the complexities of life, most of the things we notice in passing on our way to something else. And then you get the feeling that you're skimming over the surface of the depths of your own life. And what's regrettable is God's unexplainable oneness with you is hidden in the depths over which you're skimming. See? But in moments like this, like a hiatus in sequential time, you're born again, like you're quickened like this. And then being quickened, see, what would be the path? This is what the word religion means, religio. A religio is a ligature, to be rebound to the origin. And we need to be rebound because we've been exiled from it. So how can I be rebound to this upwelling of this flowing out of this divine generosity, which alone is ultimately real? And how can I be more habitually sensitive to it and responsive to it so I can live it every day and share it with others by the way I treat them and listen to them and walk the earth, so on.
Is there a particular, I'm sure you've had many experiences over your life, and I don't know if there's ones you talk about or would be comfortable talking about where you could describe a mystical experience you've had?
Yeah, I'll say one that I say in the memoir. I'll share one. In the monastery, this is a cloistered Trappist monastery. And so we got up at 2:30 in the morning chanting the Psalms, the canonical hours. We practiced silence. When I was there, we didn't talk at all. We used sign language. We didn't like communal silence to listen to God. And so it was a life of prayer, silence, simplicity, and manual labor, seeking God, to give ourselves to God, and believing that inner fidelity to that seeking touches the whole world in ways we don't understand. That was the way. And Merton was my novice master. He led me in this and led me into the mystics and so on. So when I was in the midst of this life, which I was there for 6 years, in the wintertime, it gets cold in Kentucky. Sometimes it gets decent snow, sometimes it's light snowfall. But one was winter Sunday, it had snowed a lot. And on Sundays, we were allowed to walk across this little country road that cut through the monastery land and go in these expansive woods on the other side of the. I used to like to walk in the woods there, and I sat in the snow at the base of a tree, and I sat very, very still, and I put my head back against the tree, and I looked up through the bare branches, and I could see the snow falling down through the bare branches. It was very silent, and it was so silent, I could hear the snow hitting the snow, like that hiss sound, like where the snow hits the leaves and so on. It was just so still. And while I was sitting there, a full-grown deer came by with a head full of antlers, like his eyes full of God. It came walking by. But I was sitting, he turned and looked at me, but I was sitting so still that the deer looked right at me, but the deer didn't see me. And my heart was pounding because I know if I scared it, it could hurt me, it could charge me. I was sitting there on the ground. And it walked right past me, walked on through the woods. And so I looked up to the bare branches of the trees, and silently within myself, I said to God, is this the way it is with us? And looking up through the bare branches and the snow coming down from unseen places in this gray sky, I'm looking right at you, but I don't see you. And if I don't see you, I don't see myself either, or the snow or the trees, because I am your manifested presence in the world. Like this, help me, like this. And I just sat there like that for a long time, like just given over to that. I got up and walked back to the monastery and chanted Vespers. So there were a lot of moments like that for me uh, in the monastery. And then when I left, I wanted to continue living that way and married. So I set aside a quiet time every day so that I could stay grounded in that depth dimension for me.
When that moment is happening, I know from my own experiences, there's sort of like a full body
Yeah.
sensation and numbness. Would you be in that kind of state?
I would say psychologically, it really varies. Sometimes you can burst out laughing, sometimes just the gift of tears, sometimes you start crying. Sometimes you're numbed at one level, but only because you're highly energized at a more interior level, like you're deeply awake, like it's a heightened state of consciousness, really. And it's like that. So it spills over into the body in different ways, into the emotions and memory and so on. But you can tell as it spills over, it has reverberations and emotions, but it's deeper than emotions. It spills over into insights, but it's deeper than what thought can comprehend. It's like that. You're betwixt and between two worlds. It's like a gate of heaven, I think. See? Yeah. And then you say, well, then what would be the path that I could live in an underlying habitual sensibility to this oneness that I know is always there, always, which is the path.
One thing I'm very curious to get your take on is when we talk about, for example, me listening to your meditation and the be still and know that I'm God. That was a completely sober experience. But there's a big conversation, a lot of talk right now about psychedelic drugs, marijuana, mushrooms as spiritual, tools to get you to that place. You have people like Ram Dass, a very influential
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
Hindu thinker, and a lot of Christians who take mushrooms or smoke a joint and have a conversation, and they're describing the oneness, and they're seeing themselves in nature and in this whole new way. What is your take on drugs like this, and are they spiritual to you?
They can't. First of all, they're often not spiritual because they're addictive, and uh, and they're destructive, and it's kind of the confusing burden to a lot of people. But they can be awakening. And there's more and more awareness of cannabis and other drugs, but in treatment of disease, in pain management. And there's a lot of neurological research being done on that. And it has religious connotations in certain indigenous cultures, a mood altering substance to heighten these mystical states. Analogous to, say, sweat lodge, for example, like different ritualistic ways of evoking this. But this is my sense with the drug, with cannabis. And this was Merton's insight, too. Is it's true, it awakens the physiology of these experiences. But unless your character is open to being surrendered over to God, you get caught in the physiology of the experiences, but it doesn't nearly translate into holiness. See, it doesn't translate into a godlike, godly person, see, who lives in the love nature of God in every breath and heartbeat. And that's the problem with it. It often has the person stop. And by the way, I was just reading Evelyn Underhill's Mysticism this morning a little bit. And she starts out her classic work on distinguishing between magic and religion. And she said the art of magic is a heightening of powers for yourself. So you're drawing powers to yourself, magic, through chanting, through different magic. Religion is a surrendering ourselves over to the abyss-like mystery of this love, transforming us into itself unexplainably, religio, to be rebound. And that's the trouble in that terminology, is it so easily becomes, often is magic, see? And we get stuck there. But it does have the potential. It can be an awakening experience of the mystical, where the person then seeks it in prayer and meditation in daily life. It can be that.
Is it something that you've dabbled with in your spiritual practice? Has it been a part of your routine at any point? If you want to talk about it, if not, I totally get that.
No, for my wife, she just died 2 years ago of Alzheimer's, right here at home, in-house thing. And Maureen, and for 30 years, she was alcoholic for years. She gave me permission to break her anonymity. It saved her life. It saved her life. So we lived right at the beach, the ocean's right outside the door. So every evening at sunset, we would sit out there, and she would sit there and have iced tea or something, and I'd have a glass of wine or some alcoholic drink, and I would write on one of my texts, mystical texts. We called it muffin hour. Called a muffin hour. So there's something about the ritual of wine or something, and quietly sitting with the sunset, with the beloved, all that. But with marijuana, I never really, when I was first got married, my first marriage when I left the monastery, I tried it 2 or 3 times, but I didn't care for it for some reason. I don't know, I just didn't. But just recently, just a few months ago, I tried it. I got a joint. They opened up a joint store right around the corner. Yeah, and I tried it. I tried it again. I tried it now about 3 times. It's okay, but I don't find it all that. I thought I was more relaxed, but I tend to be very relaxed anyway, so it didn't do much for me. I just said I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it just for the sake of altering. Like, I don't need to have my consciousness altered, so it just isn't my thing. I mean, I just don't. Um, but I know some people I've worked with in therapy, like musicians and creative people, they claim that a little bit of marijuana helps heighten their awareness, and they're not like that. So it's personal. It depends if you do it in moderation and why you do it. You do it responsibly, and so on. Yeah. That's how I see it.
From my experience, to not use them to the fact that you can alter your consciousness just through your going within your own mind without some sort of aid seems to be a much more constructive way to do it and less addictive way. And there's less problematic things, but it is just, to me, it's just fascinating how this conversation has just changed and the openness to people to these products.
I have an online course that's going on right now, a Center for Action and Contemplation, called Mystical Sobriety. And it's the mystical dimension of each step of AA, that we're all addicted to habits of the mind and heart that cause suffering. And so explore the mystery. And one of the insights that I share for me, and I work with a lot of addicts in my therapy practice, and in my meditation group, a lot of people, their 11th step, conscious contact with God, they would come to the meditation sits for that. The way I put it is this, sometimes, is that the alcoholic, is that the alcoholic makes an amazing discovery, really. Their discovery is that their problems are not their problem. It's their consciousness of the problem. And they discover by alcohol they can alter their consciousness. And once they alter their consciousness, it numbs them to the problem. But the trouble is, it numbs it in the wrong direction. See, it numbs it by distancing them from the ability to be grounded and face their life. And then they got two problems. They have the problem of the addiction, and they're powerless over it. It's taking their life. And secondly, the developmental growth or their own maturity stops. This is why when a person comes to sobriety to the point that they're, through their higher power, they're freed from dependence on the substance, then they face the emotions that they drank not to feel in the first place. They have to face their fear and their anger and their rage and their self-pity and and they have to, so emotional sobriety, which then leads to spiritual sobriety and transforms their life. Yeah.
To shift gears a little bit, I really wanted to have some dialogue with you about Jesus Christ. Would you define Jesus as a mystic?
Yes, I would say theologically, Jesus is the Christ. Jesus is the Christ. So the Word made flesh and dwelt among us. So whatever it means to be God, whatever it means to be human, are now entwined inseparably into a unitive mystery. And so in Christ is revealed that God's response to us in our dilemma is to become identified with us as precious in the midst of our dilemma. And uh, there's that. But experientially, another way of looking at it is Jesus was a Jewish mystic. Jesus was a Jewish mystic. And here's one way that I put it, like prayerfully reading the Gospels and Jesus. It's what if we could close our eyes. With our eyes closed, we could be interiorly awakened. So that when we opened our eyes, we'd see through our own awakened eyes what Jesus saw and all that he saw. What would we see? We'd see God, because Jesus saw God in all that he saw. And what's really mysterious about it, when you sit with the Gospels, it didn't matter whether he was seeing the joy of those gathered at a wedding or the sorrow of those gathered at the burial of a loved one. It didn't matter whether he saw a prostitute or his own mother. It didn't matter whether he saw his disciples or his executioners. It didn't matter whether he saw a bird or a flower. Jesus saw God in all that he saw. And Jesus said, you have eyes to see and you do not see. There's your God-given capacity to see the God-given godly nature of standing up and sitting down of everything around you. And you don't see it. And this is the source of all your sorrow. This is the source of all your confusion. And so the prayer is, Lord, that I might see. Lord, that I might see through my own awakened eyes your presence right before me in everything that I see, the godly nature, the concreteness of things. And that's how I see it.
You know, you grew up in the Christian tradition. I want to get into this interfaith stuff here shortly. But in the Christian tradition that I grew up in, and maybe part of your early teaching, it's Jesus it's Jesus or nothing. Jesus is God. Jesus is the only person you really need to look at. But for you, is Jesus Christ the greatest mystic of all time? Like no one tops his mysticism? Or do you even talk about it in those terms?
The mystery of being a person is the mystery of the infinite presence of God being presencing itself. As the mystery of being a person endowed with the capacity to recognize God as being given and poured out as life itself, so that we might, in seeing the generosity of God, the divinity of the immediacy of everything, might be moved then to give ourselves in love to the love that gives itself to us in every breath and heartbeat, because love is always offered, it's never imposed. And that's universal. That's universal in religious consciousness. But the language that a person uses to express that awakening is the historically, culturally specific way. And so when it emerges in India, it emerges in the dispensation uh, of, uh, uh, of the Yoga Sutra, of the Yoga Namaste. I am that. See, when it emerged in the Buddha, it emerges as the Dharma, the Four Noble Truths. And in Judaism, it emerges in the deepening of Torah and the prophets, and then uh, in Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and so on. And so in Christianity, it emerges in the Christian mystics, like this. So it isn't. So we would say theologically, the overwhelming image is God. The Word made flesh dwelt among us, revealing all of this to us. And that's our overwhelming image to us, all-encompassing. But for the Buddhist, the all-encompassing image is the Buddha sitting all night on the night of his enlightenment, the cessation of suffering. See, when he turned and saw the day star, he saw the purity of the phenomenal world, boundaryless and pure in all directions. In the Bhagavad Gita, and so on. So we can be enriched. One, our own Thomas Merton put it this way: the world will not survive religion based on tribal consciousness. But if those who take the religion all the way to its hidden center, they find that the tradition transcends itself in this realization of God. And when they move toward this hidden center, like the Hindu, the Jew, through contemplative prayer, through silence, through perpetual surrender, they recognize each other at the center. And so there was a series on a long time ago called The Long Search. And this person has spent a year living with people in the different religions of the world. So he spent a year in Saudi Arabia. He lived with a Muslim family and the imams, and he would go and so on. He got steeped in that. Then for a month in Israel, he lived with a Jewish family on a kibbutz in Judaism, the high holidays and all of that. He lived in southern France with a Catholic family. He lived in the South in America in a Baptist family. He lived in, it was like that. He moved India as a yoga. And he said that he got the impression that if all these religious people could all get together at once in one place, it'd be an argument so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. But if he could gather together the handful of people that had the most profound effect on him when he was in their presence, and so there'd be silence and a deep respect for each other. And when they did speak, there wouldn't be any attempt to convert or change anybody, but to each bear witness in his or her own way to this overwhelming plenitude of this deep awakening. And I think that's very close to what Merton's sensitivity was too. He said, Merton once said, the regrettable thing about the Christian missionary movement is that all too often the Christian missionaries failed to realize that people they were converting were as or more holy than they were. And this is at the heart of Richard Rohr too, the Living School. See, the new orthodoxy is this orthodoxy of love, of this all-encompassing love. And so for us, that's our path. Is Christian, is Jesus. I keep the Eucharist here at my home, and I have icons all over the house, and I walk around with my rosary all day long, like this, and it's just like that. But I'm also deeply at home with the Dharma. I was deeply affected by the Dharma, the statue of the Buddha here, and all that. So that's where I'm at. That's how I see it.
Do you believe that if Jesus could see the way that his name and his life and story was taken by many Christians, that he is worshipped, that he is put above all else, would that disappoint him? Did we miss the mark in what he was trying to tell us?
Well, here's how I see it. At the Last Supper, there was a traitor at the table. Things weren't off to a good start. When you look at it, and hanging on the cross, what's the view from the cross? You look out, what the hell's going on here? And so this intermingling of brokenness with the preciousness that permeates the brokenness and can touch the heart and break hearts open. And so the light shines through. Remember me when you come into your kingdom, the thief hanging on the cross next to him. This day you'll be with me in paradise. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And I think that's the mystery of the gospel, that we're infinitely loved broken people. And the deep acceptance of our brokenness is the opening to which the tender-hearted mercy of God enters our life as repentance and faith. And so it isn't as if we're trying to live up to something and we get discouraged because we never live up to it. Rather, we're not to put our faith in our ability to live up to the standard. Rather, we're to place our faith in God, who's infinitely in love with us, and our inability to live up to the standard. And that's how I see it. I think that's... Thomas Merton once said, we should always meditate when we're discouraged after a fall, like we've done something really, like we goofed again, and especially if somebody saw it, we lost our temper or whatever it is. And he said, because what it reveals is our secret agenda, a holy me. See how you could do something like that, but moi? See? And what it does, it exposes this internalized image of ourselves we're trying to put forth like this. And instead, we're trying to let this light of infinite mercy shine through the image so we can let go of it. See, how can the issue is not it's not that I am who my father told me I was, or my mother, or my lover, or my spouse, or my pastor, and the image isn't who I think I am. How can I join God in knowing who God eternally knows me to be, hidden with Christ and God before the origins of the universe? That's what matters. See, how can I do that?
And do you think many Christians are missing that vision, that sight, because of a sort of tribal hold on Jesus and an exclusive truth? And how problematic has that been for the message, basically?
I think that is often true. What I mean is, I think God's present in their life. In the midst of we're all walking around in the midst of our limitations, and so through devotional sincerity, that the presence of God is real. He walks with me and he talks with me and he tells me I am his own. And the love we share as we tarry there, no other has ever known. It's real and it's efficacious, but it's within these limitations, often unacknowledged limitations of this tribal thing. And so I think that's what the word Catholic means, is universal. It's it's ever more inclusive. It's ever more all-encompassing. It's ever more. It's not a belief system dependent, but rather it's on dependency on the mercy of God, on which everything depends. And Thomas Merton said, the real way to study Buddhism is not to read a lot of books on Buddhism, it's to meet a holy Buddhist. He said, an unmistakable quality of genuineness. And the real way for them to know Christianity is not to read a lot of theology books and footnotes on the gospel, it's to meet a holy Christian. And so this holiness is this childlike, radicalized transparency, this gratitude, intimately lived and shared day by day. I think that's what we're all trying to move towards, I think.
Talking about Merton, he was so, from what I can tell, revolutionary and ahead of his time in his interfaith work. How ahead of his time was he, and what was his worldview on other faiths? How did he get to that point?
I think he changed. I think that in The Seven Story Mountain, his autobiography, there was a lot of Catholic triumphalism, the truth of the Catholic Church. And I studied medieval philosophy from Dan Walsh, who taught philosophy at Columbia. Merton said in those classes. And then Walsh came to the monastery and taught metaphysics at the seminary that was training for the priesthood. So I got to about the philosophical theology of Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure and Scotus. It had a very deep effect on me. And Dan Walsh said once in a class, he said, all human beings must seek the truth except Catholics. They know the truth. That's Catholic triumphalism. And I thought, really? And so you see flavors of that in Merton. But he really changed. He, in the late 50s, early 60s, there's that conversion experience where he was in Louisville for medical treatment, standing at the intersection of a street in Louisville. And he said he suddenly realized he loved all those people. And he wrote a book called Seeds of Destruction against the Vietnam War, against the atomic movement, atomic weaponry, and so on. He wrote a book on these deeply social issues, and he began to also Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, another book like that, and became also deeply interested in this dialogue with non-Christian traditions, that we have so much to learn from each other, and that's why he went to Asia, and he met the Dalai Lama and so on. He died there on that trip. He was electrocuted on that trip in 1968. And let me turn this off. It's a Richard Rohr group. Sorry about that. They're helping me. They're helping me with my computer for the back. But sorry about that. I thought I had it off actually. Uh, and so he kind of like universal. See, he once said, uh, just before he died, in his Asian journal that he wrote, he said, "The more I'm with my Buddhist brothers and sisters, the more I appreciate my faith in Christ. May Christ live in the hearts of all of us." So it wasn't leaving Catholicism, but it was a Catholic universal Catholicism that included the presence of God in these pathways of Buddhism and Hinduism and so on. He said, I believe the time is coming and is already here when a person will identify with more than one religious tradition at once. He said, I believe this is the work of the Spirit moving through the world. And that makes sense to me.
Yeah, me too. And just on a quick aside, and I don't want to stick in this area too much, but the mystery surrounding Merton's death, because he was such a radical thinker, because he was pushing the envelope in the religious circles, his anti-war stance during, when the Vietnam War was happening and all that. Some people there, if you Google it, so many people are still trying to theorize about whether or not the CIA or the government, he was
Yeah,
assassinated. Do you give any thought to that these days? Do you care
I
about
do.
yeah, what's your latest thinking or knowledge on that?
There's a
Or
lovely hour-long thing on the mysterious death of Thomas Merton. I can't think of the name. He researched it in depth, and he was talked with a person who was there when he died, when Merton died. And I think it's entirely possible. I think it's entirely possible that our government, the CIA, killed Thomas, but we don't know. See, he gave his last talk. You can watch the video of his last talk, and he said, "I shall disappear." And he went up to his room, and he was to give an answer, question and answer period that night. And he didn't come down, and he there was it was in Bangkok, Thailand, and there was a fan high up on a windowsill. And then they think he went over to turn the fan towards the bed to take like a siesta, like to rest. And it's 240 volts. And when he grabbed it, there was a short in the fan. And he grabbed it and he fell back, and the fan fell on his chest. And so when he didn't show up, they went into the room and saw him lying there, and he had died. And so was the short put in the fan by the was he killed or not killed? We just don't know. I think it's entirely possible. Not not beyond that.
it's really mysterious what happened, and just to die with so much more life and knowledge to spread. It's a pretty interesting thing. A lot of people are still curious by it. I'm wondering too, in kind of learning about you and your life and knowing a bit about Richard Rohr's life and Thomas Merton's life, how does one know when they're being called to be a mystic or to devote their whole life and being to the thought and the study of this kind of stuff? How can you discern that?
I would say first of all that there's mystical moments and mystical reverberations in the life of all of us that we were talking about earlier. This sense of the reverberations of an unexplainable fullness of presence, of the presence of God that kind of illumines our and re-energizes our faith and our life. And I think that, but the call where that mystical thing becomes, here's how I put it, is that that which is essential never imposes itself. That which is unessential is constantly imposing itself. But sometimes these inner quickenings that we've been talking about, this taste of oneness, there's a higher order wisdom of our awakened heart, like the imperative of our awakened heart, and it becomes something personal for us. And a person doesn't plan this. I don't think a person. Thomas Merton once said, he says he thinks there's many people who are being led in this direction, but they have no one to help them to understand what's happening to them, no one to give them encouragement and guidance. So for some people, they can't explain it. But a person might say, for example, unless I spend some time each day in a quiet rendezvous with God, like here I am, Lord, unless I'm faithful to this rendezvous in your presence, I will not be who I believe deep down I really am and I'm called to be. And so there's an obediential fidelity to this. And so when I read the Gospels, when I read the mystics, I can tell they're talking about what I long for. And I can use them to guide me and to help me. And when I open the Gospels and read the Gospels at this level, this deep level, it resonates within me like this. One way I put it sometimes I'll say that everything that Jesus says interiorly recognized is like falling off a cliff. They will never, 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 never get to the bottom of anything he says because it's the abyss-like depths of God's voice in the world speaking to our heart. But when we approach it out of our ego, it's like a wall of sheer granite. You can't see past it. And so the words of, I say this as a Christian, the words of Jesus, but it would be for this Hindu, the words of the Yoga Sutra, the Bhagavad Gita. For the Jew, it would be deep Torah study, Kabbalah and so on. And So for some people, it just becomes an inner calling. And so, where can I find a community of people, a sitting group, a meditation group, a prayer group? And that's what I think the podcasts are turning to the mystics, like monastery in cyberspace, that there's a collective uh, recognition of each other and words of collective encouragement on this path. And it's just the way it is. And it's not, such a person isn't more holy than others, but it's a deepening realization of how unexplainably holy everybody is.
You've studied a lot of mystics and are in that space yourself. Is there always sort of a particular moment or of a series of dramatic events that the calling becomes sort of a burden, or it becomes a tunnel vision focus? Because it doesn't really seem like the kind of life you kind of ease your way into, and it seems dramatic. Would that be correct?
Well, I think this is the value if you can find a spiritual director, like a contemplative spiritual director, because we're subject to self-deception like this. And um, and so, for example, for some people, the lure toward the mystical can be a way of finding a rationale for distancing themselves from the concreteness of their own life. Happens fairly often. But if it's really authentic, it actually radicalizes and grounds us in the strength of God to face our own life. So it takes because we're open to self-deception, it's the art of discernment, the art of discernment. And so it's the direction I'm moving in, helping me to be more grateful, more humble, more patient, more empty-handed, more receptive to learn, then it's probably genuine. If I'm more judgmental, more closed off, maybe we should take another look.
It's a good point, because I've wrestled with this idea before. When you start to feel like you're becoming awakened or enlightened, you can have that seed in your head of you want to tell other people, you want to express it.
Yeah,
But on the
yeah.
back of that, if you're really good, like yourself or Richard Rohr, you become famous, you become celebrities, you sell books. And it's just the way it is. Thomas Merton, you've said this before. He, in his time, he's a celebrity, right? You were starstruck by him. So how to how to make sense
No.
of that? How to make sense of that?
Here's how I see it. Here's how I see it. Uh, a person who's mystically awakened, the mystic way does not draw attention to itself. Matter of fact, sometimes you meet somebody, sometimes it's a grandmother or a grandfather or someone, you get the feeling you're in the presence of a deeply present person, but they're anonymous. There's just the transparency of their goodness or their love or their inner clarity. And when I used to give these silent retreats traveling around, and the meals were in silence, and people would talk to me one on one. I'd meet so many people who are on this path. But some people are called to be mystic teachers. Not only have they given this gift of oneness, but they've been given the gift of finding words that helps other people find their way. And a lot of those gifted teachers are contemplative spiritual directors that are also unknown. They're a spiritual director and people come to them and people find out that they're there. But once in a while, somebody gets like a wider audience and they become like a mystical celebrity, like Richard Rohr, Thomas Merton, whatever. And it just it has to do with it's not artificial, but it's a kind of a product of what happens when your teachings are exposed to a lot of people. Then a lot of people respond. And so if that happens to you, it's to not buy into it. I mean, it's God's will. Sometimes I tell people, especially as I gotten older, I'd be giving these silent retreats, and people would come up to me and shake my hand, and they would say to me, "I'm so honored to be in your presence." That's what they would say. And inside, like truthfully, one voice inside says, "Really?" Like, I'm just trying to get through another day. Another voice inside says, "Now don't hold back. Feel free to express yourself. I love being in the presence of people who are honored to be in my presence," like this. And at a deeper level, I know what they're really talking about is the presence of God. That's what they're really talking about. You see it mirrored in somebody. Thomas Merton once said, speaking about Zen masters, too, once said, is that we recognize it in somebody. And so when you sit with the master, the teacher accepts the recognition. The master also knows that what you recognize them is completely true of you, but you're not ready to hear it. You won't believe it. And therefore, out of compassion, as a temporary arrangement, they accept as a teacher. Until in the Buddhist tradition, they have the tradition of slapping the master. You don't actually slap the master out of respect, but it's a gesture because you're delightfully unemployed, because there's no master, because it shines out of you in your ordinariness. See? And so, yeah, so that's how so God raises up people this providentially with a wider thing, but it's just one on one, it's just heart to heart. It's just
It's an interesting point. I mean, I guess for me, my discernment, if I can discern someone's an asshole, I don't necessarily think they're super enlightened.
right.
Because the ego, when the ego is intact, and that's what's really drawn me to your work, to Richard Rohr work. When I learn about your life story, when I listen to you, I just sense that humility. So I think it's interesting to get your reflection on that. And
A couple. I don't think. However, you can be an enlightened asshole, and you haven't integrated your brokenness into the enlightenment, and you can use it to sexually abuse people. You can use it to exploit people. That your own brokenness will use the enlightenment in the service of. So it calls for perpetual conversion, always, always. And under this image of Merton, who he shares in the Asian Journal, he said, from time to time it happens that someone breaks through into God. He says someone recognizes that person's breakthrough, the mystic, the awakened mystic, the teacher, and they sit with that person. And there is formed there in that place a contemplative community that no one can ever destroy, because it's not composed of compound things. It's not composed of empire or structures. And let's say you're living this way, in a heartfelt way, you're on this journey. And someday someone comes up to you and says, do you mind if we talk for a while about this? You say, no, sure. And you walk up the road together. There's formed there. This is a talk you and I are having right now. See, no, sure, let's talk like this. And there's formed here in this moment a contemplative community that no one can ever destroy like this. And that's how the lineage, I think, is handed on endlessly throughout the world, really heart to heart, I feel.
it's beautiful. I mean, I got the chills were starting to go, but I couldn't let them fully go. I wouldn't be able to focus on the interview. I appreciate that, Jim. I want to talk to you a little bit about trauma. Like, for example, when people turn to meditation and they seek this oneness, it's often in times of pain or confusion, or the world and life feels really heavy. I know I can speak on my own behalf. And I saw a thing you described it quite beautifully, I thought, when you talked about, we're here to learn how to love, and then God breathes us back into the infinite love. But part of that process of learning to love is so much pain and heartbreak. So why do we need, it's that classic question that I'm always wrestling. Why do we need this idea of coming here to learn how to love? And then is your idea there that we take that somewhere else and these experiences and the pain to a new dimension and use that?
There's a sense of the brokenness of human nature, like original sin, not as a blight on the soul, but a sense we're experientially exiled from the upwelling of this love that's sustaining us breath by breath. And if the etymology of the word trauma means a wound, see? So our capacity to abide in the self-donating love of God sustaining us breath by breath is traumatized. And in that traumatized state, we act out the traumatizing things we do to ourselves and to each other. So there's that. And so there's the moral imperative we're always working towards being a non-violent, protective, nurturing person that doesn't contribute to suffering. And when suffering does occur, we're committed to become someone. How can I ease the burden of the suffering in myself? And how can I go to someone maybe who can help me, the friend, whatever, or professionally, the physician or the mental health person. But here's the key to this. It's true, it often comes welling up out of suffering. So for me, in my memoir, it started for me when I was 3 years old. And my father was a violent alcoholic, and my mother was a devout Catholic. And when she would take us to Mass on Sunday, a lot of their fighting was over Catholicism. She would take us to Mass on Sunday. She said, ask God for the strength when Daddy gets mad. That's how she puts it. And one night I was lying in bed, about 3 years old, and I heard him hitting my mother outside the door in the dark. And I prayed the way frightened children pray. And I experienced that God heard my prayer, came to me in the dark, and merged with me. That was my experience. And throughout my life, the sense of God merging with me deepened and sustained me through the trauma. Through the high school, it got worse. So then when I discovered Thomas Merton in the 9th grade, The Sign of Jonas, it had a profound effect on me, really. And it's out of that when I graduated from high school, I was moved to enter the monastery. So I found a lot of people. And then when I left the monastery, I wrote a book called Merton's Palace of Nowhere on ultimate identity beyond the ego. And when that book came out, I think it was 1979, I was invited to give a silent retreat by a clinical psychologist, John Finch. And I gave the retreat on Merton and the true self. And he said, if you'd be willing to commit yourself, I was a high school religion teacher at the time, married with 2 little children. He said, if you would commit yourself to the contribution mystical traditions make to mental health, I'll see to it that you have a PhD with family support as a gift, not as a loan. And so I moved from Akron, Cleveland, Ohio, to out here to California in 5 years of full-time doctoral work. And I became a full-time therapist. And the people I saw were mainly people, trauma survivors, who wanted their spirituality to be a resource in their therapy. So I watched very, very carefully how sometimes it's in the very midst of the healing journey. This is true of 12-step work too. In the very midst of the healing journey, that the light can shine through. And when we risk sharing what hurts the most in the presence of someone who will not invade us or abandon us, we can learn not to invade or abandon ourselves. That's true. We can be reparented in love. But also what can happen even deeper is what Jesus called the pearl of great price. In risk sharing what hurts the most, there comes welling up an intimate realization of being unexplainably precious in my brokenness. And I can learn to live by that preciousness. And that's where I think the deep psychological touches the spiritual, and they merge with each other in an integrative way. That's really been my path, really, I think.
Your story is one of overcoming great trauma and pain and turning it into beauty and to hope and to inspiring others. You channeled it in the way that you're describing. But one thing I struggle with, and I want your perspective because you know this subject 10 times more than me, is it seems like some people don't channel it before they die. They commit suicide. They live as, like your father, a violent alcoholic, and they're the people I see when I walk out onto the street that are just seem to be living in abject hell. How do you reconcile the fact that some people, maybe millions, billions over the course of history, never channel it in the beautiful way that you're describing?
It's true. Many people don't. And so my understanding is this. How can I become a healing presence in an all too often traumatized and traumatizing world? See, how can I heal the world one person at a time? First, by the people I live with, the community, and so on. And then, for me, it was a psychotherapist and as a writer. But many people, they die in that state. So I believe that when they die in that state and they pass through the veil of death, the healing occurs in eternity. But it often doesn't occur here for a lot of people. It just doesn't. Well, I make sense of it in that it doesn't make sense. Not everything makes sense. A lot of life makes no sense. See, meaning, how could you adequately explain or justify it in a way? Oh, I get it. That explains it. Thank you. I'll move on to my next question. See, so it's not a question that calls for an answer. It's a question that calls for a response of your whole being to be open to the mystery. And how can I follow this path? And how can I let God use me to serve God's purposes in the world by my own fidelity transformation like that? And look at the war in Ukraine. I mean, look at racism, the black light. I mean, just and but I think it's always been this way. I mean, look at Jesus. It was the Roman Empire and the crucifixion. That the world is a divine, elegant, beautiful, brutal, cruel, brief, and unfair place. It always has been. See? And there's this, what's his name again? Meeting Jesus for the first time. Uh, I love this image. He's a biblical scholar. It'll come to me. And he wrote a book on the last week of Jesus based on the gospel, what that last week was like. And he gave this image. He said Pontius Pilate was coming from Rome as procurator from Rome to preside over the Jewish people with soldiers and armor and so on. And coming from the other side in Jerusalem was Jesus riding on a donkey and people waving palm branches. Hey, Zana, hey, Zana, 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 hey. He said the real question in life is which parade do you belong to? That's the question, because both parades are always there. And sometimes both parades are in our own heart, sometimes too. The bittersweet alchemy of our own call to perpetual conversion and humility and so on. So it's a mystery and it's a mystery that Jesus lived in. Jesus entered into, God so loved the world, not the ideal world. He entered into this world. God sent He sent His only begotten Son, which is the holiness of this world and its brokenness. And how can we bear witness to it? And it's like that, I think.
So many people that don't want to get into the kind of line of thinking and the stuff that we're talking about is just looking at the nature of reality, and they don't believe that a loving God is there. Where do you stand on those kind of conversations about the origins of where the suffering comes from? Because the Christian tradition would take a very basic explanation of a gentleman named Lucifer, who is a fallen angel, and it explains that thing. Is that a metaphor that most people don't understand, or what do you think Jesus tried to tell us about the origins of that, or what else have you learned from other faiths?
Well, I put it this way. Let's say there's a person who's the atheist who looks at all, like, how could there even be a good God and all this evil happening? It makes no sense. They don't buy it. And that's just where they are. That's their faith, really. So the atheist doesn't know there's no God. They have a kind of a faith that there's no God. They don't know that there's no God, but they have a faith that there's no God. So how I put it is this. I say I'd like to talk about something else first before we talk about this. If there's somebody in your life that you love very much, right, I think of that person. And also think of your gratitude for that person in your life. And also know that although you could explain a lot of things about this person, describe them to me, and so on, that there'd be something that's be closer and closer to the heart of the matter that you could not explain. I say that's religion. When a husband tells his wife, I love you, she doesn't say, define your terms. Or she doesn't say, where, I didn't know that, let me write that down. Or she doesn't say, you said that yesterday, you're so repetitive. See, why does he say it over and over to each other? Because every time they say it, they reawaken to each other the love that the words awaken and embody, like this, like a mantra, like this. So it depends on what we mean by religion. I think religion is what gives meaning and value to our life. Bernard Lonergan says religion's a lot more like falling in love with someone than it is proving something. And so that's where we need to go is where's that person's sincerity? Let's start there. And even though they don't believe in my language for it, like explicating the ultimacy of it, that's okay. I mean, we just take each person where they are, and
So this this week, there was this, as we're speaking, this incredible tragedy with this earthquake where
yeah.
20 plus thousand and counting people can be dead in the blink of an eye because the earth shifts and opens up. I mean, it's stunning. How do you make sense of a moment like that, or is it impossible to? And what do you learn in a moment like this? What have you learned when you've observed tragedies as you've gone through your life on that scale?
But this is one way I put it. In incidents, or also anyone who's a trauma survivor, this is true. Whatever it means that God takes care of us, it doesn't mean that God takes care of us in protecting the bad thing from happening. It doesn't. That's the mystery of the cross. Come down from the cross. He said, come down. It doesn't mean that at all. And that's why I say God is a presence that protects us from nothing, even as God unexplainably sustains us in all things. that before the question can arise with meaning, we need to sit in silence first, to come to this interior depth dimension out of which to speak in a meaningful way. And so all those people that died, uh, they're eternal because no one ever dies. Everyone created by God lives forever in God. But our life on this earth is, our life in ego consciousness is a temporary arrangement, and how long we live. But can we find in the fleetingness of our life that which never passes away and sustains us on, like the eternality, the fleetingness of things? So a tragedy is a tragedy. It's a nightmare. And you see the response it runs from people coming in trying to help, like the goodness of humanity. See, how can we help? And so none of us are protected. I don't, like when I got up this morning, put my feet on the floor. But there are many people who went to bed last night with big plans for the day. They didn't wake up this morning, and they're eternal in God. And so I think too, when my wife died, when the beloved crosses over, that the land between birth and death becomes more diaphanous or transparent. Like the beloved is gone, but at a deeper interior level, the lover is just as close and one with each other in an unexplainable way. And I'm not stuck here either, because soon I'll be joining her. I'll be 80 years old in May. I'm not stuck here. And so what's the celestial nature of the day by day? And how can I live life on life's terms, they say in AA. And how can I walk the walk that way? And then how can I increase conscious contact with God in the 11th step? The ribboned through the unexplainable complexities of life.
So I guess you said two things that I thought were interesting. It's this belief that I think is, when I first heard you and Rohr talk about it, is so radical that we'll all be united with God. We're all saved. We'll all be resurrected into that oneness. So death, the way we think about it, is it's such a mystery, and to fully understand what that life lost means, we'll never understand. But we can have faith and hope that there's a reunitedness, that there's no actual death. It's a physical death, but not a spiritual death. And that's where that hope comes from.
Can I learn from God how to die to everything less than an infinite union with God as a final source of my security and identity? See, can I learn from God how to die or to pass beyond or to let go of anything less than an infinite union with the infinite love of God as a sole basis of my security and identity? And I can't do it alone because the survival instinct is too strong. The survival instinct is too strong. But can I learn through meditation and prayer and love and this? Can that thread that keeps me connected become more and more delicate? John of the Cross once he said, a bird held by a single thread is just as much a prisoner as one held by a great rope if it won't break the thread. And so we can't break the thread of ourselves, but sometimes love breaks it. See, through bliss, through loss, and the light shines through. And we get a foretaste of a fullness. And here's the thing about it. In the moments we see the flock of birds descending, where we hold the beloved in our arms, or we lie in the dark listening to our breathing, we're in the nearness of a presence that doesn't have about it the feeling of that which ever ends. That's what I think is so significant. Or it doesn't have about the feeling that it has boundaries, like we could go out to the edge of it and find where it stops. It doesn't. It's a beginningless, endless, boundaryless, deathless. You will just intimately realize in the depths of my heart. And as I learn to live by that, I think approaching these questions at that level is a spiritual dimension to the temporal order, the psychological order.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Jim, I just had a few more questions. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, it's okay.
I wanted to just a quick question. I'm curious your take on it. As a guy that's raised in the Catholic tradition, I heard Richard say once that Catholics have made an idol out of the Pope. And I look at the Pope today, Pope Francis, who's considered to be progressive in terms of Catholic thing. And the past few weeks, he said this thing about homosexuality that, it's definitely a sin, but it's not a crime. And that was seen as a radical thing for a Pope to say. But do you think the papacy, if that's the right word, the Pope,
papacy,
the
yeah.
papacy should basically be abolished because it's a relic that holds back the progression of the message that Jesus was trying to spread?
No, I don't see it that way at all. I bet if I don't. Did he say it's definitely a sin? I don't think he said that.
I think he said homosexuality is not a crime, but it's a sin.
Wow, I'm surprised. That's too bad he said that. Yeah, here's how I see it. Uh, if you look at the Roman Church, it's very ancient and it's very big. It's very complicated. Saint Cardinal John Henry Cardinal Newman talked about the evolution of doctrine, and he says doctrine evolves to the epochs through time. And so when it comes to sexuality, uh, I think we're really in the midst of an age where there's been a standard thing about homosexuality being condemned, that it's wrong. If you're born with the male body, you're a man. If you're born with a woman's body, you're a woman. It was all set. And I think what's happening, uh, we're kind of in the midst of the of transitioning into another new way of seeing all of this about sexuality, sexual orientation, and everything. And in the midst of the transition, what you see, Martin Heidegger puts it this way, but he said, in the spirit of the age, there is the energy that brings about that age, like our present age. There is the spirit that sustains the age, keeps the status quo going. And there's the energy that brings about the end of the age. And what brings about the end of the age clouds within it the energy that's the spirit of the next age. So when you're between two ages, there's conflict. There's those who try to hold on to the way it used to be, like homosexuality is a sin. And there's those that are rethinking the whole question in a new way about sexuality, the mystery of it, the orientation of it, like what it is. And we're in the midst of it. So I think that's where it is. But I think the day is coming that we'll be eventually moving to. Here's how I put it, kind of tongue in cheek. God could have saved the world so much trouble if he just would have made Jesus a woman. Seriously. And you say to Jesus, like the 12 disciples, like, what were you thinking? Why not make 6 of them women and 6 of them men? So religion transcends the bias of the culture, but religion is also culture bound. Really, and that conflict between is very mysterious and theologically subtle. And so anyway, that I approach it with these kind of concerns. Is how I would approach this.
We talked about homosexuality, but I mentioned this, that I was going to ask you about this, but the idea of transgender is a huge conversation right now, which is to a certain, is a huge debate in secular circles and Christian religious circles about whether this is a true reflection and a true way to express yourself. What do you think about people who come out and try to transition into a different gender and believe they were born in the wrong body, basically?
I think that, first of all, it's complicated. And this is especially so with people who feel this way in their adolescent, to have to change their gender and so on. So there's whole questions around when you're old enough to make a responsible decision and so on. But there are people, say men in a man's body, who interiorly experience and know themselves to be a woman. That's their experience. And there are women who know themselves to be men. That's their experience. And so I think it's experiencing the atypical expressions of sexuality. It's not typical, but there's atypical expressions of this. And we're just at the beginnings of understanding it and how to responsibly work with it. People could research this. I can't think of her name right now, what her name is. But there was a big article in the Wall Street Journal that one of the wealthiest corporate business people in the world is a woman who used to be a man. And this person is a worldwide leader in pharmaceutical work and also in what's that radio show where you pay, there's a radio program, you pay a monthly fee, and I know she owns that. So she was a woman who, yeah, Sirius, the owner of Sirius, right? It was multi, and the person had a sex change. Is now a woman. I met her, like a brilliant, wealthy, gifted, grounded person had to courageously walk that walk and be that way. And so I just am open to, and I'm not knowledgeable in this. In other words, I'm a clinical psychologist, but I've not studied the journals and I'm not in on an informant. So these are simply my ways I would tend to start to approach the question as a clinical psychologist. And someone who would come to me and say the experience of himself, I was to respect that, try to understand it better and help them find their way where they want to go with that. It's not my business, not my life. I mean, what do I know?
So, yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, I would follow a similar line of thinking to you, but people just see it as such an affront on God's order. And it reminds me too of this, what I think is stupid, the debate about pronouns for God. And
Yeah.
I don't refer to God as he or man because it's so obvious that God is not a man, and there's no, he's man and woman and brother moon, sister star, and all that stuff, right?
This comes up in writing a lot too, where you're writing a book like God is he and she. Uh, the gender does not apply to God. So God is infinite, boundaryless presence itself, transcending uh, terms that apply to us but not to God. But however, because God is the creator of gender, male and female, he created them. The infinity of the mystery of being a woman and a man is in God and is divine. And there's a kind of historical patriarchal dominance of men over women. Part of it is just physical dominance and political dominance. The church, like an all-male clergy in the Catholic Church, for example, you kind of see that. But I think we're coming more. What I would like to see is the church would move first toward reactivating women deacons in the church. In the early church, women were deacons, because then you'd have women in holy orders. Next, in the shortage of priests, so you would ordain some of the deacons as women as priests, and married people as priests. And if you just continued that and moved along in those lines, eventually this present set of assumptions would fall into the background, I think, really. But it's because these things are very ingrained. They're very ingrained. I'm not concerned about it, about the thing about the church. There's no concern of mine. I don't care about it. But mystical Catholicism, what I mean, this divinization of the self in the Eastern and Western Church. I'm deeply Catholic in that sense, but the institutional structures and so on. But I'm a layperson. If I were a priest, I'd have to be more engaged at that level. But I don't care about it. No, nothing. I respect it. I respect it. I had a deep respect for the devotional depth of it. But these things have no concern because they're not real. I mean, I'm so used to working with people in therapy one-on-one, like, tell me what hurts, let's talk, and let's lay back the layers one at a time and let's find our way. I tend to deal with things at that level.
With your work at the Center for Action and Contemplation, you work with Richard Rohr, and I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your relationship with Richard and sort of the influence he's had on your spiritual life and thinking.
When I read Thomas Merton when I was in the ninth grade, and then when he was my spiritual director for several years as novice master. And so I saw that he embodied the mystical lineage of the Christian tradition. I thought he was sitting in the presence of a lineage holder as a living mystic. And he led me to the mystics from the cloister. So then when I left the monastery and wrote Merton's Palace of Nowhere as being like a contemplative married person, I got word Richard Rohr was very widely known on this circuit. And I found out that he liked Merton's Palace of Nowhere. He liked my book. And we met on the circuit several times. And I saw that what Merton achieved in reawakening the timeless lineage of contemplative Christianity in a cloister, Richard Rohr was reawakening it as a Franciscan in the world. I saw him as a living mystic with like a mystical depth of pastoral sensitivities like this. So I was invited several times to lead retreats with Richard. I was invited to that. And the Center for Action and Contemplation and the Living School. And so the Living School is going through changes right now, sorting out details. So basically, what it is a commitment to daily contemplative prayer and meditation, an in-depth study of the Christian mystics, and translating that into a form of service to the world. It's not, there's no exams, nothing, just personal enrichment, the transformation of your life. And they listen to the talks on the classical text by the teachers. They have dialogue with each other and so on. So I so identify with it as just contemplative Christianity and action in the world. And so I'm so grateful for my Richard Rohr is my dear friend, and we keep in close touch. He's kind of at a very fragile, but very good place in his life right now. So he's just been a dear friend of mine and companion, and along with the other teachers, Brian McLaren and Dr. Barbara Holmes, Mirabai Starr, these other teachers, and it's home base for me. I feel so at home with the Living School, you know.
Richard is stepping back from public life
Yeah.
because of his health. How is he doing?
I think this is fairly public, really. So sure. Is that for a while there he was with cancer diagnosis. People were worried about him, and he was declining. But they found a new treatment, and he's really rebounding in terms of energy level. He's pain free. I don't think he doesn't feel called to get back into administrative work with the Center for Action and Contemplation again. But it's like a new phase of his life, like a new, very present. And hopefully we're going to be in Albuquerque together with the students, so I'll get a chance to see him again face to face. But he's doing well. He's in a good place.
Do you think his legacy will be in the lineage of a Merton for future generations? You see it
Uh,
already being there?
I do. You know what I think is, in the Middle Ages, back centuries ago, there was a movement of the Beguines. They were contemporaries of Meister Eckhart, and so Michelda Magberg and others. These about women. It's really great mystical works, really, as a quickening or deepening of mystical Catholicism. And I think that we'll look back at Thomas Merton and Richard Rohr and the Living School as in the history of Christianity as the reawakening of the contemplative mystical dimensions of discipleship in the world. I do. I think it's timeless, really.
Just to sort of wrap up here, Jim, some people listening to this that would be skeptics of these mystical experiences we're talking about and say, perhaps we are placing meaning in a meaningless world. We are creating through evolutionary sort of experiences these ways to cope with this very difficult existence. What do you say to people who approach you with that sort of naysayer attitude?
Well, as Dr. Fo would say, I'd say that's fine. Dr. Fo would say, how's that working for you? See, and if you think that's nonsense, why don't you share with me something in your life that isn't nonsense? Your love for your children, your spouse, your work. Let's talk about what gives meaning and substance to your life. If you don't believe that, you don't have to know that. And if you're close to it, I don't understand that. I guess I do. I don't know. But at least you show that if you're interested enough to want to know more about it. And if you're not, we have no basis to talk about it. I don't want to waste your time. Talk about something you don't want to know about. But if you want to know about it, like the tone of this talk we just had, and kind of see where it goes, that's fine. The real question is the quality of their life and their goodness and their character and what they do live by. Yeah. Dan Walsh used to say at the monastery, he said the cynic communicates nothing. And if you are going to criticize something, it's good to show some awareness that you have knowledge about what you're criticizing. But if you have no knowledge of it, it might be wiser just to be quiet about things you don't understand because you've never even tried to understand it. So why be disrespectful towards something you know nothing about? I would think it'd be wiser to refrain. You could say, I personally don't identify with that. That makes sense. But to sweep it away as if, in a way I get that, but I think it's better not to do that.
Just as a very, very last quick question, you listen to the greatest atheist thinkers and they can't rule out 100% that God doesn't exist. You listen to Richard Dawkins, he would never say 100%. You study this stuff, you've experienced this stuff, you've inspired people to look into this. Is God real? Is there any doubt left within you after all these years and all this study.
You can't get at it logically. See, isn't that strange? We say God is all about us and within us, closer to us than we are to ourselves, but we look around and there's no God in sight. But also notice if with the beloved, if I'm with somebody who's my beloved, I see their body of the beloved and the personality. But what it is, I know them to be, and my love for them, I can't see it. I can't explain it. I can't. And so I would like to bring that sensitivity to it. So I would say, God does not exist. There isn't some infinite being called God who exists. God does not exist. God is the name that we give to the beginningless, boundaryless, beginningless, endless, infinite plenitude of existence itself. See, because if I could prove it, it wouldn't be God. Thomas Merton once said, the person who says prove it, not only are they not at bat, they're not even in the ballpark. See, if you're capable of proving it, it'd be infinitely less than what we're talking about. So we don't prove it, but we intimately bear witness to it. Thomas Merton once said, he said, the most important things of life are often the things we can't explain to anybody, including ourselves. He said, but there's certain things you simply have to accept as true, or you go crazy inside. He says, and they're the very things that's the intimacy of the unexplainable, and we learn to live by it. Dan Walsh used to say at the monastery, I know it, I know it, I know that I know it, but the trouble is it's I who know that I know it. When I try to tell you what it is that I know, I don't know what to say. And so this is the voice of lovers, this is the voice of poets, this is the voice of mystics, this is the voice of, and that's the approach I feel comfortable with.
That's beautiful. And maybe the best way to end it is the way you end every chapter in your book. Amen. So be it.
Yes, exactly. Yes, amen. So be it.
I ask these questions and I seek to speak to you and listen to your work because sometimes I feel called. I felt the calling a little bit, but I don't know what to do with it. And yeah, I don't know what advice you'd have for me. This is not,
Well,
yeah,
I always found this way, but I suggest you might want to leave it in. Might want to leave it in
yeah.
instead of editing it out. I would suggest this: you being moved to offer this website and have these talks. This is you obeying the call. This is the call, and where it will lead, you'll see what God has in mind. You don't know what's next, but you're following like an imperative of your awakened heart. You're on the in via. You're on the path of obeying this call. And I would see it more that way.
Yeah, we'll see what happens, but I think it's a day at a time, and these are all parts of the journey and being introduced to your work and stuff, and it's beautiful. I'm grateful for it.
Yeah, but I want to say something else about you again. That they're watching this or they're listening to this, and they might say about you, they're so grateful that you do this. You're such an amazing person, and the sincerity of your questions and how you help bring these people to others can benefit and so on. You're such a helpful person. They're so grateful, and there's truth to that. But you're just yourself. What are you doing but trying to live your life? And it's like me, we're all trying to, and sometimes we're called to be a medium of putting people in touch with this.